I'd like to welcome Mark. Mark, thank you for joining us. Thank you for bringing what I know will be a really interesting topic. So over to you. I'll let you introduce yourself and I'll let you share your screen now, but thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you ever so much for giving up your time to come here as well today. I hope this will be useful. I'm going to try and cover what's going on in the inland boating scene at the moment, and also looking forward to the future as well as to where we might move off to, and also some of the concerns and quick wins that can be done by boat builders as well. And we know it's not a perfect situation as well. We're in a slightly difficult times, of course, but also there's a lot of changes afoot in terms of regulation and also in terms of how we might be approaching and using powered pleasure craft in the future as well. So my email address is there for you, and if you do want to contact me, then please do. So my role is I'm the technical editor of Waterways World magazine. My background is partly in the marine industry and partly in physical sciences as well. And so I'm talking to you from York today. But please do not hesitate to contact me at all if I can help, or you want a discussion about something offline as well. And of course, on the Waterways World website, which has been updated recently, you can post questions, and myself and the other members of Waterways World staff, particularly Rupert Smedley and Graham Booth, will answer technical questions as well. But also our website is expanding more to actually incorporate and try and widen the appeal to people outside of the core demographic of Waterways World readers. Okay, so the first bit I want to actually say is that the market at the moment is actually really quite healthy despite coronavirus, and actually a lot of boat builders have some quite full order books well into 2021 and beyond, which is really positive because the market is quite worried. The second-hand market has also done quite well, and like the other parts of the leisure industry, so the camping caravaning side, there's been quite an upsurge over the summer about actually saying things as well. People have been more interested in staycations, and people are looking forward to the future as well in terms of their leisure activities. Steel boats tend to still be the principal market, certainly for canals and most of the rivers, but the GRP cruiser market is still actually really good, both for private purchases, but also for building of hire fleets, where the boats tend to be in use for an awfully long time as well. There's a lot of 1960s and 70s boats that are still used for hire, whereas the steel hire boat market for narrow boats tends to have a much higher turnover and rate of craft. And as you would expect, there's a huge demand, certainly from the new boat market, for residential and continuous cruising boats, rather than just boats that are simply used for the odd weekend and week afloat. And that does skew how boats are built as well, and how boat builders often approach it. And we know that the second-hand market as well does have a high residential focus, particularly for people looking for cheap accommodation in some of our larger cities as well. And that does mean the demographics of people approaching the markets can be quite unusual in terms of the fact that many people have never boated before. And it's not unusual to see at the Crick Boat Show, or speaking to boat builders, that we have somebody who's coming who's willing to pay more than £100,000 for a boat and has never actually been and spent a night on a narrowboat or wide beam boat before. And that does lead to some issues. I did do a review a couple of years ago with a very nice wide beam boat, which had been plonked into the Grand Union Canal above Braunston. And the owners had never handled a boat before. And so they moved this 70-foot by 12-foot 6 wide beam boat 400 yards down the canal before my review, hitting everything in sight because they hadn't had any formal instruction. So after the review, we spent a day actually doing some boat handling. And that's not, unfortunately, untypical. So the industry itself, I think, does need to actually become a little bit more supportive of people who are new to boating in terms of when boat buying, actually thinking about supportive training. And some boat builders actually do a really good job of that. So the traditional narrowboat that we might think about, so here with one with a boatman's cabin and separate engine room, that is actually very rare these days. And of course, installing a new boat with an old engine is not acceptable practice at the moment, and actually probably something we shouldn't be encouraging because of the emissions from them. But this idea that people see these types of boats and that's what they think about canal boats, that's very much down in the market in a very niche area at the moment. So the majority of narrowboats go for one of 4 hull styles, and the top left there, where we have the traditional narrowboat with the short stern deck steering from within the hatch, that's very rarely chosen by new boaters. And those that do go for that design are probably ones that are coming from a background of having boated a lot. 30 years ago, people have often started with a very small boat, maybe a GRP boat, and then worked their way up until they get the narrowboat of their design. That doesn't seem to happen very much these days, and so that means the traditional stern, with all its advantages and some disadvantages, is not that common. The cruiser stern at the bottom left there, that one obviously was the mainstay of the hire boat market, but now is actually very, very popular as well. However, it's the semi-trad stern, which is what on the right-hand side, that is the most popular. However, it's also very closely with the semi-cruiser stern now, which is just a slight little development of it, with shorter side decks. It's quite easy to actually sit out there, and it makes it a bit more commodious when underway. And it also encourages people to sit out of the way of the tiller arm as well. And so that's where we're sort of going there. Now, boats like this are very rare. To actually move away from a narrowboat style into something like an inspection launch, whilst a lot of people in the 80s and 90s experimented with it, and obviously they are the traditional leisure boat of the canals, they're very rare to see. And sometimes they can be quite challenging to sell when they appear on the second-hand market. So a lot of boat builders don't touch these with a literal long shaft either. Wide beam boats are still popular, but potentially less so, because actually where do you put them? There is a limit to the number of spaces available that will take a wide beam boat, particularly once you get a place like the Thames, and obviously the Southern Grand Union and the Lee and Stewart navigations are getting pretty chock-a-block, and trying to fit a broad beam boat onto a canal that was designed for pairs of narrowboats and being able to single out isn't going to be necessarily good practice. However, this does lead to sometimes people buying these boats and fitting them themselves, and that's because a wide beam boat is much easier to fit out. There's very few people now who go and buy a shell and fit it out themselves from a narrowboat point of view, but they're more likely to buy a sail away that's wide beam because they can throw in domestic furniture, domestic kitchen units, and it becomes a perceived much easier way of fitting it out. So most of the sailaways that are produced by boat builders these days tend to be broad beams for people to do a DIY fit out as a cheap way to live afloat, certainly not as a cruising boat, because many of these boats are actually, as one of my former colleagues used to describe them, vaguely pointed floating bricks and have very, very poor hydrodynamics. So they're not designed really for long-term cruising because they can be very difficult to handle. And there are still some small boats around. So things like the Wilderness Beaver as a tradable boat, or the Aintree Beetle as small narrows, still do attract a niche market, but they're not as popular as you might expect them to be, despite the advantages of lower running costs and with things like small GRP boats, being able to actually take them off somewhere and have a cheap view outside. And also the fact that they're smaller boats requiring less power and potentially doing less damage to waterways if they're well designed, with less wash, less displacement, could be a good thing to encourage in the future, but a lot of people don't actually think about that. And unfortunately, a lot of the design of boats is about the interior. Most boat buyers now will actually view the interior as the key thing, and they don't really care about the shape of the hull or how it handles, because they may often not come from an experienced boating background. So we'll often see boats like this, for example, which has a luxurious fit out, but actually has very short swims and doesn't particularly handle well through the water. And that obviously has implications for the amount of energy it's going to be requiring to move it, but also the potential damage it does to the bank by the breaking wash or by the drawdown on the bottom of the canal. And so when we got designs like this, which is a wide beam boat, we've actually got very, very short swims, and which is one of the reasons that many of the wide beam narrowboat style boats don't handle very well, is because their hydrodynamics are very poor, short swims, and we still are pushing most things by diesel engine. And we haven't really moved very far for the majority of boats from diesel engines, apart from small GRP cruisers, which tend to be powered exclusively by four-stroke petrol outboards. Very few of the smaller GRP boats are powered by diesel inboards. They're only reserved for the very expensive Broads and Thames cruisers, because it's not cost effective generally to install them on smaller crafts, say under about 28 feet. So standard conventional installations like this are the most common way of doing it. And many boat builders have not moved and advanced the way they fit boats in the last 30 years in terms of diesel engines. apart from the adoption of water lubricated stern tubes, which are done partly because they're easy for a boat builder to do, but also in theory they're low maintenance, although that doesn't always work out. And otherwise, not much has changed for conventional diesel installations. And certainly at the lower to mid end of the market, that's what people are willing to pay for. It's a rather crude installation of light industrial diesel engines. Moving up, some people have actually thought about actually making the boating a little bit quieter, a little bit easier. So putting in hybrid systems and putting in remote hydraulic systems where you can bury the engine somewhere else in the boat. But that brings a price cost with it, which means that it's actually inaffordable for a lot of people. And cost is a big driver for what people want in a boat. And so a hybrid engine like this can add £4,000, £6,000, £8,000 on top of the cost of the boat, which might be around 10–15% of the cost of the vessel. And parallel hybrids like this are becoming more common on top end vessels. So where the diesel engine can propel the boat on its own, or the electric motor can propel it, or it can be a combination of both with the alternator, sorry, with the motor becoming an alternator. And parallel hybrids are much more common than series hybrids, where you have a pure electric motor and a small diesel, usually diesel generator to charge the batteries when required. And the reason for that is, if you have that, if you have a pure electric drive, you may need quite a large electric motor to be able to cope with tidal waters. Whereas having a parallel drive with a diesel engine means you can have a lower powered electric motor for general canal cruising, and then when you need the extra grunt, you can actually use the diesel engine to do that, which is why it's so popular at the moment. But that tends to be on the much more expensive craft as well. And powering both hybrids and general boats, the electrical systems are still relying on lead acid batteries. So here, these are 2-volt cells to give a 48-volt nominal voltage for a hybrid system. And the reason they're chosen is they're cheap and they're actually fully recyclable. Whereas a lot of lithium installations, the actual lithium batteries have a very high energy density. They're very expensive, though they can be charged and discharged really quickly and to a greater depth of discharge. But actually, they're very, very difficult to recycle currently because there's no standard way of doing it and standard way of producing lithium iron phosphate batteries. So the cells that most boats have are based around lead or potentially lead carbon as well. But that does have limitations for the amount of energy we can actually store, which limits us when we go and hopefully move to much more vibrant technology. Solar panels are becoming ubiquitous, and it's often quite easy to spot whether a boat is going to be mainly tied up or whether it's going to be moving a lot. Boats that tend to be used for cruising will have their solar panels adhered to the deck, and that reduces the efficiency, but it makes it much more boatman-like. Whereas boats that tend to be staying in one place will have framed panels that can be tilted towards the sun. But either way, the amount of solar energy we're gaining on boats is getting more. And some hybrid boats are managing, certainly in summer, 2 or 3 hours of cruising a day based purely on the solar recharge that they can actually achieve. So a combination of a hybrid engine, hybrid drive system with solar panels is proving to be quite pragmatic, even in UK climate as well. But all this change in electronics and increased demand, particularly on higher end boats, is leading to much more complicated systems. And a lot of boat builders are not actually that competent in doing this and are having to bring in a lot of specialists to be able to make sure this system works. Whereas most boats 30 years ago would have had 2 leisure batteries and potentially electric fridge and very simple wiring. We've now got very complex systems with multiple inverters in there. And a lot of boat builders don't understand the information, and often they don't read the manual when installing something. So if they're moving to doing something like installing hybrid systems or advanced solar charging, they actually often have to bring a specialist in to do that as well, which is a good thing in many respects, so that the installation is done well and it does meet standards as well. And these systems are becoming increasingly connected as well. So on this boat particularly, as well as having a very complex electric system, there is an interface touchscreen, which can also send information to the owner's mobile phone, and they can register an app. Even with GPS tracking, the boats are becoming more connected, and with devices even such as fridges being able to speak through the Internet of Things and tell you when things are running low or what the temperature is. All those types of things are becoming much more connected. And boat builders are having to actually increase their game, particularly at the top end, to actually accommodate this. However, this type of controls are becoming much cheaper and much easier to actually install on lower price craft as well, which hopefully will mean that as we move through and start upgrading and changing things in the future, it will become easier. Although we know that electronics protocols change, so the system installed on this boat may not actually function and talk to anything in 20 years' time. And that's always going to be a difficulty of embedding new electronic technology in as well. And so the amount of information you can get from this type of stuff is phenomenal. It can measure everything. It can measure when the engine service is due. It can measure how much diesel is in the tanks, how much water is in there, and not just whether it's half full or quarter full, but actually measuring flow volumes as well, to actually measure the flow and return to a diesel tank. So we can actually start measuring genuine fuel consumption. And the data that's coming out of hybrid boaters is they're using, if they've had a similar boat before, they're using less than half the diesel fuel that they did before, because of the way the engine is, and the electrical systems are managing the consumption of the boat. So that's got to be a really good thing, and I'll come back to some of that later. And then we're having pure electric drive system. So this was actually on a boat which I'll come back to a little bit later, but it has twin electric Lynch motors which drive the propeller shaft. And actually, when the boat is moored on the river, this can be set to actually charge the batteries again by the flow of current across the propeller. And actually, they were generating about 3/4 of a kilowatt of electrical power just from the boat sitting in the general flow of the current, which is a slight difference to just using solar panels or wind generators, for example. Going on to the inside of boats, and the most common boat that's still built is a 57-foot or thereabouts supposed go-anywhere boat with a reverse layout. So the reverse layout probably should be the normal layout now, which has a galley and saloon at the aft part of the boat and bathroom and bedroom toward the front. And that really is the one that will sell. If that appears on a broker's second-hand books, it will go very quickly. And so the inside of a typical boat is designed for a couple. And there's very few boats designed and built now, certainly in the sort of above £60,000 range, where it's designed for any more than a couple with occasional guests aboard, sitting on a fairly uncomfortable dinette to sleep, which doesn't encourage them to stay too long on board a boat, possibly. And the layout and finish, very common. It's cream painted panels, oak or ash wood facing. Increased use of MDF on boats. So waterproof MDF actually possibly warps less than marine or WPB ply. So actually boat builders are embracing more modern materials in terms of the things behind that 10, 15 years ago we may have dismissed as being cheap rubbish, actually have proven to actually have longer life on boats, although potentially with some environmental costs in their manufacture as well. Wide beam boats, again, very popular for boat builders to build because it doesn't cost them much more to build them because it's only extra steel and wood. The appliances tend to stay the same, but it does give a whole raft of different layouts. Although this was an interesting boat that if you totaled up the electrical consumption, it came to about 45 amps of current required if everything was on at once. And most boats and shorelines and marinas are still only supplying a maximum of 16 amps. And that actually is part of the sustainability issue that we're going to have, particularly for boaters that are going to stay in moorings and marinas, is the infrastructure that we have is not keeping up with the demands that we have on boats as well. There are some boats that are produced with more modern interiors and can be seen sometimes as being quite clinical. So very modern, sort of being inside like an IKEA showroom almost. However, often the second-hand market really does not like these at all, and they don't really hold their value as much as you would expect them to, despite the costs. Owners might love them, but it can be really challenging to actually sell them. And at some point, a boat owner or their family is going to have to sell the boat. And that conservative idea of what the market likes has persisted for quite a long time. You do have some very interesting takes on fit outs, and this was the inspection launch that I showed earlier. This is styled on Queen Victoria's railway carriage, and it's opulent is an understatement, but it is very much the owner's design. And I'm sure this will be quite a challenge to actually sell in the future, even though it's a fantastically fitted craft with all manner of inlaid marquetry. It is unusual, and that unusual nature is not something that we often see, but it's a fabulous boat. And if it suits the owners, that's always a good thing. When it comes to bathrooms, most people have now settled on walk-through bathrooms as actually being the most common and effective layout. It fits well with a reverse layout boat. Quadrant showers, the most common things to have, sometimes square showers, but actually baths, which started to appear on boats in the 1990s and early 2000s, they've all but disappeared now. So the sit bath and the shower bath, which are actually quite practical if you've got kids aboard, have disappeared, mainly because often there aren't kids aboard, or if they are, they're only there for a short period of time. And as for loos, well, from standard installations, it's now a 50-50 split between a cassette loo and a macerator pump now. And boaters will still talk about it, but a lot of new boaters really don't like the idea of handling their own waste. Unless they've come from, say, a caravanning or camping background, they're probably not used to using cassette toilets either. We also have two extremes as well. Composting toilets are appearing a lot, and they're particularly useful for boats that are lived on for long periods of time. They don't work very well for short periods. And the ones that separate out the urine from the solid matter, they really work quite well, but you still have to carry that urine out. Or, unfortunately, some boat builders have done, just pipe the urine disposal straight overboard, which is illegal and causes some consternation. At the other end, we have incinerating toilets, which are came onto the market last year and have actually taken off quite well in very top-end boats. But there's a huge environmental cost to this because you're using several kilowatt hours of energy to incinerate the contents every time or every few times you go, mainly to evaporate the water content. And they can either be powered by LPG or even 230 volts if there's a hybrid system fitted, for example. And although very low residue, so very easy to dispose of the remaining ash, not necessarily the best thing we want for the environment. And solid fuel stoves, another one that is actually reducing being fitted on boats, partly because of the perceived mess, but also partly because some areas and some marinas are starting to impose limits on emissions from boats. So there are some marinas that will ban solid fuel stoves from being lit. And we know that local regulations in London, for example, are trying to improve the quality of life in waterway areas, and actually reducing the emissions is quite important. And solid fuel stoves, unless they're well installed, will not meet the emission requirements of clean air zones. And a lot of boaters don't see the need to have those now. And diesel central heating is now becoming ubiquitous, and gas central heating has all but disappeared, except for very small boats where it may be used as a warm air system. Whereas 20, 30 years ago, gas-fired central heating was the most common installation on boats. Yet the price of heating from all angles is about roughly the same. But what we also need to think about, and boat builders haven't touched on this very much, is that actually for boats that are on permanent moorings, if there's a decent electrical supply, then electrical heating is probably the most energy efficient, environmentally efficient way of actually heating an interior of a boat. And boats, if they're well insulated, don't actually require that much energy. And hopefully as we're going through installations like this that boat builders still sometimes churn out are actually getting less. So the professionalism of a lot of boat fitters has improved markedly in the last number of years, but it's still not perfect. And a lot of boat builders don't actually think about how the systems will be used and maintained in the future. So fitting things like expansion vessels and actually how you accommodate changes in water pressure, how you actually drain down systems, how you actually empty the antifreeze out of an engine and do a coolant change. A lot of boat builders don't plan for long-term maintenance. They plan for getting the boat to look well and look good, but they don't plan for how owners might actually access things in the future. And that's the sign of experienced boat builders still, particularly those who come from a hire boat background, who actually make things accessible. And generally the very successful boat builders will start thinking about it, but even then, a lot of boat builders will find a few years down the line that they're really struggling. And even things like actually restraining gas cylinders, making gas lockers actually safe and secure, rather than just barely meeting the regulations, and making them usable. So as our boating population is getting older, lugging around 13 or 19 kilogram propane cylinders is quite difficult, and actually accessing them on many narrowboats and wide beams means crawling around a crutch panel and trying to get into a bow locker. In the middle of winter, that's not necessarily appropriate for somebody who might be in their 80s and starting to struggle with mobility issues. And one of the things that boat builders need to start thinking about is, as our demographics of boaters do become older, then we need to be thinking about how easy can we adapt our boats to go into? How can we make access easier? Can we actually fit that in the boat building stage? When somebody might be buying a boat in their 50s, are they actually planning for, well, if they're going to keep the boat into their 70s and 80s, that their access and ability might actually change somewhat? And there's a lot of things that boaters could actually be doing to actually add into those missing bits. So some of the good practice items that we know that the boat safety scheme talks about, such as putting bubble leak detectors in gas supply systems, many boat builders just don't bother with that, because it's not something that they see as being that urgent thing that the owner will see straight away. It's more of a long-term thing, and a lot of boat builders don't have that vision. And when it comes to sort of good practice in terms of things like ventilation and energy loss, most boats have water-cooled engines and they will heat the hot water, but there's still a huge amount of energy that is just discharged into the canal, into the environment. So heat recovery systems, either in ventilation or heat recovery systems using the engine's hot water to heat the inside of the boat, for example, are very rarely touched. And they're quite easy upgrades that boat builders can make. But again, it's that longevity and that thinking about the environmental cost. And one of the things I would like to be seeing is at some point in the future, we start actually giving environmental credentials to boats. Now, this has been tried under the sort of the RA's Green Blue initiative, and at the Aire Rally, national rallies a number of years ago, starting actually giving eco credits to boats, but actually having a national harmonized system that actually starts rating things. Because we do need to start changing and upgrading what we do. I mean, even things like sound insulation. Boaters are spending 140, 150,000 pounds on a new boat, and it's as noisy as a boat from 20 years ago, and not even thinking about going down the route that other parts of the marine industry do, which is actually good sound attenuation to actually make these things as quiet as possible. And through going into sustainability, we actually need to be thinking about the end of life of boats as well. So somebody once asked me, how long does a boat live? And it said, well, as deep as your pockets are, you can keep a boat going for almost forever. But at some point, boats will have to be destroyed. And we have an upcoming problem from the 50s and 60s of a lot of GRP boats that are end of life, and they're almost impossible to recycle. Steel boats as well, and the components in them, we need a way of actually being able to recycle those end of life and actually have an understanding of what's gone into it. And there's lots of other things that go in. So we're talking about using composting toilets and other more environmentally friendly matters. But then the power consumption of boats increases. Ventilation's poor, just holes indoors, for example. It doesn't necessarily work very well. And there's also a big elephant in the room as well, which the IWA is looking at through the Sustainable Propulsion Group, is, are we going to have diesel fuel forever? That's the biggest thing that we have at the moment to propel our boats. Are we going to actually have access to that? Are we going to have biofuels available? Are we going to use bioethanol, biodiesel? Are we going to have hydrogen fuel cells? Are we going to use compressed natural gas rather than liquefied petroleum gases? So are there other alternative sources that we can actually use? There's also the issue of grey water. A number of countries across Europe have barred pleasure vessels as well as commercial from discharging grey water, so waste from sinks and showers, directly into the environment. We try and stop people using phosphate-based detergents, but an awful lot of the stuff that goes, shower gel, shampoos, etc., is not good for the environment. So should we be actually capturing that and actually processing it ashore, rather than it just being discharged into the environment? Very few boats have filters in their bilge water system to actually remove any trace of oil contamination. And we pride ourselves on being in love with the environment when we're out boating, because it's what we're in. It doesn't matter, as colleague Rupert Smedley will say, it doesn't matter what type of boat you're in, the canal looks exactly the same. And we want that canal to be good, but why are we not putting more time and effort into making sure that boaters are having a much reduced impact? And grey water is a big one. In some large marinas, if you've got lots of residential boaters aboard, they will be discharging significant quantities of detergent from washing machines, from showers, etc. And we need to think about how that's managed. One boat that we looked at a couple of years ago, which is very interesting, is a boat that is virtually entirely self-sufficient. This boat has over 6 kilowatts of solar panel array on the superstructure. And this is the one that I showed you earlier. It had the Lynch motors, the two that can drive, and also charge through the propeller as well. And this boat is built to very high energy standards. And it has air handling systems that can recombine energy. It has a thermal mass concrete floor, which acts as a ballast. So even lighting the solid fuel stove to heat the boat, you might only have to light it once every 2 or 3 days, because the triple glazed windows with thermal brakes, etc., the air handling system that allows air to come in, be reheated by the air that's being exhausted. The hot water is heated by the solar heating as well. The cooking is by electric induction hobs. It even has a rainwater harvesting system. So the roof area can filters down through a series of filters into a storage tank. And then there's a huge immersion tank, which is heated at a low energy level by the sun. So it's actually a complete self-contained boat. The downside of this, the first boat they built, it was built on a fairly basic unhydrodynamic shell, which meant it had lots of losses of efficiency. But even in winter, there's enough power on this boat to provide for 2 or 3 hours cruising a day at 3 or 4 miles an hour, and all the domestic use is needed as well from an energy point of view. And boats like this are going to be the way forward, or one of the ways forward, where boats become much more self-contained and much more conscious of the environment they're in. But that does need a sea change from both boat builders and purchasers to have those considerations, but also potentially legislative pushes as well to make sure that we aren't damaging the environment as much. And we can make boats interesting inside. We can still keep that flair up. We can make boats the same as we have done for the last 30 years internally, but actually making them in a much more environmentally conscious way. And doing things like not just screwing vents into the back of doors to allow screaming air to blow through, but actually fitting things like air handling units that allow us to recover energy while still allowing a decent amount of ventilation so we have good living accommodations. And then thinking about actually how do we maintain the existing fleet of boats today. So this is a boat that dates from the early 70s, and it's in a really good condition because the owner knows how to look after it. They fitted the boat out, they've kept it, they've maintained it. Do we have enough support for existing boat owners to actually make sure that they can maintain their own boats? Not just paying for somebody else to do it, but actually encouraging them to keep up with that preventative maintenance, which has the good environmental consequences that actually the boat will last longer. Because at some point they're going to need to sell it, and we don't want the boat just to start disintegrating and then become more of an environmental problem. So there needs to be support for boat owners once they've got those boats as well, and not just relying on some of the more dodgy internet forums that give some very, very strange advice. So I'm going to shut up there. Please do feel free to contact me. I hope that was a vaguely interesting snapshot for you, and I'm really looking forward to taking some questions and some comments now. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'll pass back to Paul.
Mark, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And well, I've actually got a page full of questions here myself. So conscious that we've got about 25 minutes, there are questions appearing on the Q&A window, and I'd like to encourage anybody that has been storing up a question over the past half an hour or so to put that question as early as you can into that Q&A window, so that we can perhaps group some questions together and make sure we try and give as many answers as we can over the time that remains. Now, just before I go out to those questions, Mark, yeah, that was a fascinating presentation. You did cover a wide range of different areas. Certainly, I think most people know that I'm a hire boater, and I think it's really interesting to see the difference between what is being built for hire boat consumption and for general residential or cruising, and it really is interesting. I think, as you said, that we call the normal layout now a reverse layout, when actually it's starting to be becoming the norm. So we can perhaps look into that in a little bit more detail in a moment. One of the other things I loved about your slides was when you were talking about some keeping quite a upbeat style. I love that wheeled island unit, that kitchen unit on wheels. I'm thinking that's fraught with disaster, certainly if I'm at the helm, remembering to lock that down. So yeah, it's interesting what people are adding. So
actually, I'm going to just say one thing on that. It's amazing how many boat builders do not put any form of fiddle rails or restraints on shelves. I did do a boat review a number of years ago where I went out with the owners. They were not very experienced, and the saloon had this wonderful white carpet, and it went up the whole sides as well. and in the galley there was a nice wine rack. You can see probably where this is going. There was a nice wine rack facing forwards, and the owners misjudged a lock by about 3 foot, and 2 bottles of Merlot ejected themselves at high speed across the cabin because the wine rack was pointed forwards, and they exploded against the bulkhead, and the boat builder had to replace the entire carpet.
Definitely not one for Tim and Prue or John Prescott, is it? Okay, well, look, plenty of questions coming in. Thank you to everyone that's putting those through. Obviously, the boat builders have got amazing capability. I'm just keen to get a feel for whether there are any boat builders that have got the full capability, kind of from hull manufacturer right the whole way through. Do you see that sort of level of what we call, I guess, vertical integration, so that it's all under one roof? Or are you seeing that it's very much a case of specialisms, the hull, the fit out, the engines, coming from a vast array, a little bit, I guess, like today's automotive manufacturers, who are essentially brands who outsource, who design and then outsource the capability?
There's a number of boat builders who don't have the technical competence in electrical installations now. And so they're quite happy to knock bits of steel together and bits of wood, because that hasn't changed much in itself. But we'll contract out the electrical installations and the engine installations, because they are the difficult bits, and they're the bits that cause most warranty issues on new boats as well. And then they can pass the buck to somebody else.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of the key things. When you buy a boat, making sure that you've got someone to go back to and can take responsibility for all of those different aspects. I just want to jump back to your very first slide, where you were saying actually things are pretty upbeat at the moment, and obviously there are a few things when you're considering buying a boat. You're not able to get to the shows that we might have been able to get to. As people and potential boat buyers are out there in the market, how do you advise them in this coronavirus season that we're in at the moment, to go about that, to make sure that they're aware of all the things that you've just talked about? Because they could probably engage somebody like you to make sure that they're up to speed, but if they're just reading the reviews that are around, it's going to be quite confusing to them. Whereas these boat shows are really quite a good snapshot of everything that's on the market.
I mean, it is, and I think that over the next 6 months we'll see a move to some additional virtual shows. Well, now some boat builders have already done that and have had virtual open days, which have worked very well because there's quite good interaction. And I think we'll see parts of the industry pulling that together as well. And I know Waterways World will look to how they can support that in terms of not entirely a complete potentially virtual Crick show, but actually certainly having a really good support for the industry. It's also interesting, there's a lot of, certainly the larger boat building companies that have, I would say, almost fan groups as well, so they're owners clubs. That they often, through Facebook groups, that are very willing to share lots of information, the good and the bad, about their boats, and actually joining some of those groups can be really useful for people as well, possibly more so than some of the forums, to be honest, because the owners are generally very honest about their boats. Yeah, so I'm going to start tackling some of the questions, and actually some of them fit in with some of the notes that I've made on the way through. As we start to look at advances, they're kind of step changes, and from time to time we've seen in automotive or other areas of design, domestic appliances, and even what we're used to in a domestic scene, we do see some really strong step changes. And there's a question here that's just saying, are there infrastructure changes that are needed? Because actually they are limiting and holding back what boat builders would be able to do or would really like to do. There's a bit of a chicken and egg going on here. We might see massive advances. We were talking just the other night on the Waterway webinar about whether electric propulsion is really going to take off, and it may actually be eclipsed by hydrogen cell because it's much more self-contained.
What are your thoughts about what's holding our great boat building community back?
Sometimes it's the boat building community holding themselves back because they don't want to do anything different to what they've done for the last 20 years, to be honest. But also things like electric charging points. That's probably one of the more efficient ways. I mean, the sustainable group is looking at that, obviously, within the IWA. And certainly, from my opinion, it's worked very well for some of the high fleets like Castle narrowboats on the Mon and Breck, where there is an infrastructure, and it works well on that length of waterway. But as the sustainable group themselves have calculated, you need a phenomenal charging infrastructure, and not just 16 amps, 230 volts. You probably need three-phase supplies, and that becomes challenging in itself for boat builders who, if you said what three-phase supplies, they wouldn't have a clue what you're talking about. And things like hydrogen fuel cells is actually then it's the infrastructure delivery, storage, and also keeping the regulations up to date, because the boat safety standards, with all the best will in the world, can't necessarily keep up with all the developments that we have. And in some places it has been diluted somewhat a little bit as well. And so I think we'd need to take a very close look at how the standards of installation are. But certainly, yes, things like hydrogen or whether it be biofuels. I think one of the big drivers that may happen over the next couple of years is an increase in efficiency as the use of red diesel is phased out for propulsion. And I think that will stop people's minds potentially thinking, is there a better way of doing this? Because so many boats are sitting there just with their engines thumping away purely for hot water and power, electrical power, rather than propulsion.
So it's interesting because this questioner also says, is there any sign of widespread effort to address any of the blockages? And certainly in my business, we find that there's a lot of initiatives that come from the industry, but more often, as you've just alluded to in relation to red diesel, we're seeing that external regulation that may have unintended consequences for our sector in the waterways will actually end up being the driving force, and that may not be ideal. So are you seeing any positive coming together of the boat building, the wider waterways community? Maybe that's something that IWA should do more on. I know we're doing quite a bit, and it's one of the great benefits of IWA to bring that collaborative approach. But what could we be doing more by working together?
I think it's looking at also what other countries do. So, for instance, how the Dutch have managed to reduce, say, grey water pollution, and actually, what did they actually need to do to actually make that work, and how did they both persuade boat builders and the boat owners, but also how did they provide the infrastructure for those systems? And things like the RYA's Green Blue initiative, actually turning that into something that actually means something to boat builders, that actually has, whether it's kudos points, whether, we all look at, if we're buying a new car, we look at its fuel consumption, we look at its NCAP safety rating. Well, actually, should we have something that actually is a set of standards that boat builders aspire to, and that boats can be potentially rated against, without it being really heavily bureaucratic, but to give people a much better, more confident idea that actually the most is being done. But I think that certainly the IWA for the inland waterways is definitely taking a lead, and I think that can be enhanced over the next few years.
And we'll certainly continue to do that. So I'm conscious we have about 15 minutes left, so I'm really going to tackle the questions that are on the Q&A box now and really get to grips with these. And in no particular order, I'm just going to look at some of these. So maybe perhaps a fairly quick question. How many boats are removed from the system each year? Are they recycled? What are the opportunities for that? And how rapidly is the total fleet increasing across the whole system?
The simple answer is we don't know, because boats keep moving. So we'll often be moved from, say, a CRT navigation into an EA, or taken off the water or onto private waters. And because there's no central registry of boats, it's almost impossible. We know the number of CRT registrations is going up. Part of that is down to reduced license evasion as well, but the same with the EA. And then there's navigations where there is no license. So you will find narrowboats sitting in harbours, for example, on coastal waters. And it's really difficult. And as for recycling, very little.
Yeah, that's interesting, and probably something we're going to have to start turning our minds to very soon, or we'll end up with a real problem. So a question here, the questioner saying they're 63 years old, have a conventional boat, multi-fuel stove and back boiler, 800 watts of solar power, hoping to live in my boat till I die. Should I be worried? And linked to that, like you were saying that the average boating population is getting a bit older. What more could and should boat builders be doing to tackle that? Because yeah, I think as we all find our pension pots perhaps not going to pay out what we thought or hoped they might do, maybe we'll all be jumping on board.
Things like long life battery cells, things that actually don't need to replace as often. So actually, your upfront expense lasts a lot longer. But just things like access on boats. We still have a number of boats where, when they're delivered new, they don't have slip resistant paint on them. And also, I would love to throw a couple of boat builders in the water and get them to try and exit the water using the reboarding steps that they've fitted at waterline level on the back of their boat. Since 1996, we've had a legal requirement that you have to have a means of reboarding a boat, and that's never really been properly tested and enforced. So if you are a bit old and you get off, you're really going to struggle to get back on the boat. And actually thinking about, can we make boats more accessible and easier to access is a key one.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because we've been looking at how do we increase the diversity of people afloat, and whilst that's every aspect of diversity, and perhaps one of the things that we would say most, the areas that's accommodated most is older people, but maybe not the very much older. We do find that people, once they reach a certain level of a certain age and a certain level of infirmity, then it's one of those terrible decisions. The boat's going to have to go, and so yeah, I think addressing this is something we need to look at. And other opportunities of retrofitting, or are you pretty much stuck with the propulsion, the fit out? How much retrofitting and moving on is being done, and how much are boat builders actually involved in that? Would they prefer just to be pushing out fresh shells with new fit outs?
Good refurbishment works well. I mean, it's an interesting one going back to the hire fleets, where you often have 6 to 8 berth boats. Mm-hmm. Often, as soon as they reach the second-hand market, 2 of those cabins get turned into a freestanding lounge or an office instead, because the width between bulkheads happens to lend itself to modularity. And that might be something that boat builders think about in the future, is actually a modular component system. So actually, you start off with a boat that actually does allow your grandkids to come along because it's got a bunk cabin, but later on, that's quite easily convertible into a study, for example, or something else. As for engines, yes, it is possible, but you also have to balance that against the value of the boat as well. And some engines can be actually directly converted. So there are some makes of engines where it is quite possible to retrofit, if the engine is in good condition, a hybrid system on it, for example. Or whether it's possible to convert the propulsion engine into a generator instead, and then have a pure electric drive.
So if somebody is thinking of putting a hybrid propulsion system in, is that something you'd say, right, if you're thinking of doing it, do it now, we're reaching good levels of maturity in that? Or is it a case of wait a year, there's going to be big advances coming through? Or is it that
I don't think in the terms of the technology that's coming into our boats, it's going to be that huge a difference. We're probably still going to remain for propulsion for the time being on lead acid cells, because they're the cheapest bulk storage that we've got at the moment. And that's the big cost of the whole system, is the cabling for it. The motor components and the controllers are not the expensive bit. It's the energy storage.
Right.
And it's the big disadvantage on retrofitting it is, where are you going to shove the batteries? Because once you do that, you have ballast issues as well, plus ventilation and meeting the boat safety standards that are required, how you get excess hydrogen out when the battery is gas. So that's always going to be a challenge, but it's not impossible.
Do you think the existing boat building community is learning enough from other sectors? And I think about what the likes of advancing organizations like Tesla are doing, and what other organizations that would be held up as being the real experts in innovation, Dyson and organizations like that, are doing. Do we see good cross-fertilization of technical and design knowledge from some of these really leading world-class businesses?
A lot of those tend to be in the super yacht market and in the offshore, where there are huge profit margins to be had, and innovation is seen as a good thing in those markets. One of the things that, for example, we have Euro 6.1, 6.1b diesel engines in cars now, which have selective catalytic reduction, oxidation catalysts, they use urea. We're still working on barely Euro Class 1 engines at the moment in most boats, if that. And actually, those types of mitigations that could potentially be easily fitted, the engine manufacturers don't have the demand from the boating community to do that. You'll find them on big diesel engines. You'll find them on the massive super yacht engines, all these fittings, gas scrubbers, etc. But it's not cost effective at the moment for the manufacturers to develop it because there is no demand, and particularly there's no legislation for it.
Right, interesting. So a question from Aire Kaplan that came through fairly early on, that we've talked about how we should be, or how we could be focusing on the older boat user. He's making the point that in the past, boat builders were focusing on smaller minimal spec boats, but perhaps getting younger, new to the boating world populations in. That doesn't seem to be the case now. Are we finding that the boat builders are playing to that kind of middle-aged group that perhaps have that disposable income, the younger community? They might be trying to find older used boats to find cheaper accommodation in Bristol, Manchester, London and Birmingham. But are there other ways of getting them on the water in newer freshwater boats?
If we could get back to the stage where people could fit out boats themselves in a competent way and have the time and effort potentially doing that, but even with manufacturers at the cheap end of the market offering sailorways at actually quite cheap prices, there isn't the demand there at the moment. I mean, I was fortunate to end up designing one of the Aintree Beetle, which is a 25-foot narrowboat aimed at the starter market. And it's interesting that range has grown out to 40 foot. And actually, the 40 foot is the one that people want to go for more than the 25 foot.
Yeah.
And it just, even though that was designed as a starter boat, it's not necessarily the market that you would expect it to. So I think the younger generation are going to go on to keep going on to used boats, and then hopefully at some point they will upgrade and actually be better boaters for it than somebody flying in and spending 200 grand having never set foot on a boat before.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Perhaps a straightforward question, but no less important. Someone asking, how can they find a good boating electrician who can come to do a complete audit on the solar and electrical system? Maybe you'll be putting your hand up yourself for that one.
Yeah, it is actually quite easy to do yourself, actually. We did have a tool on the former Waterways World website, which is going to be transferred across to the new one fairly soon, where you can actually do that audit for yourself. But actually finding an auto electrician or marine engineer who has a lot of experience of installing and working with other boat builders is usually a good way to find out. Depends how far you're wanting somebody to travel, but we can always send you the tool if needs be. So if Roger, I think you asked that question, drops me an email, I can send you the electric audit tool. I'm quite happy to chat you through the process, if that helps.
Terrific. Well, thanks for that. A similar question. Without any personal expertise, how can someone tell whether a boat builder is electrically competent? I guess there's the safety certificates and making sure everything's done properly. What's your view on when boats do come to the water, what state they're actually in?
Neatness. The biggest thing is neatness of electrical cabling. If the cabling is well labelled, it's neat. It's actually fitted in well. There's good clamp terminals, and it just looks a good installation. I've actually generally suggest it is. If it's rather chaotic, it often suggests that people haven't added things in a logical order in there, and that's often the best bet. And making sure there's decent thick cables as well.
Good. Well, that's useful. Staying on the topic of electric, Mr. Electric, Malcolm Bridge has put a question in here, and he was just saying that can you get your opinion on the use of solid oxide fuel cells running on propane as perhaps an intermediate step before we actually get to the benefits that hydrogen might offer. Any thoughts on that one?
Yes, and I think they have a major advantage. One of the disadvantages is the amount of propane you have to store. So you're going beyond your standard 13, 19 kilogram tank to actually having inbuilt tanks. And that then starts to raise questions about installations. There's a lot of very dodgy gas installations, as my colleague Rupert will quite often testify to. And that's without going to rather more complex ones with high vapor draw systems. And yes, I think it would be useful so long as we can actually capture that energy, because obviously running them to constant rate is much better than running to variable rate. So you're using the battery bank as a buffer for the charge output. One of the other things that is being trialled on smaller yachts at the moment is using methanol, biomethanol, mixed with water as the fuel cell in an aqueous membrane fuel cell. And although at the moment the units only produce roughly about 200 amp hours at 12 volts, that's enough for domestic load. And scaling that up, it may be potentially that. One of the advantages of methanol is, as a flammable liquid, it can be extinguished with water, and it's very easily transmissible as well. And the same with bioethanol, and then you can do fuel cells the same. So I think propane may be certainly one. I think compressed natural gas actually has a lot of advantages as well, because we can generate methane from other source processes such as waste fuel. Although I'm just waiting for somebody to connect a composting toilet under anaerobic circumstances as a biodigester to their engine. That could be quite interesting.
Yes, well, maybe we'll get to that point. I'm conscious of time. I'm just going to tackle one more question, so apologies if we haven't got to your question. Brian Corbett, who was on our webinar last night, is obviously passionate about heritage ports, seemingly classic wooden historic boats as well. Are we seeing anything in the world of wooden boat building and would such craft that we perhaps have seen in the Thames in the past, maybe even see some currently? Are we likely to see them and smaller boats around the rest of the waterway system, or is that really?
I would love to see more smaller boats around, and actually building out of wood can be very environmentally conscious, even if you are using epoxy resin, because generally there is a degree of recyclability, or at least you can burn the things in safety and actually reclaim the carbon that way. I mean, it is a labour of love, though, as any owner of a wooden boat will know. Even my mirror dinghies over the years have required huge amounts of attention. But if you look at the Broad's yacht fleet, so the Broad's hire yacht fleet, there's a large number of those that are wooden yachts. So the Hunter's Yard fleet, for example, still all wooden yachts from the 1930s, no engines, just using a quant pole if you're not sailing under the gaff rig. And they are superbly designed slippery boats that make minimal impact on the environment, bar the fact they've still flushed sea toilets into the waterways at times. But I think there is mileage for that as well. And I think it is a labour of love having it. It's probably not a mass appeal, but actually encouraging people to boat in small boats. And they don't have to be a 57-foot narrowboat. It could be a 14-foot two-berth camping punt with an electric outboard on it, which is probably almost possible and feasible with the right amount of solar cells to actually be self-contained for a long weekend cruising, and then pop it on the back of a boat, back of a small trailer, and tow behind your plug-in hybrid. And one of the reasons that hybrid boats may cause a problem in the other part of the leisure market is that they can tow less. And so caravans are now actually thinking, well, actually, do we have to start making lightweight caravans again, like we did in the 80s?
Well, I think that segues nicely into just wrapping things up, because I think you've introduced us to a very broad subject. What's great about it is that there's such diversity, there's so much promise for the future, and I think we are sitting on the edge of advances and real developments, and that our boat building community around the UK is sitting in a good place to help us move forward. So Mark, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for introducing us to this subject and for dealing with those questions. Thank you to everyone else who's joined us today. Appreciate you spending your lunch hour with us. I hope it was useful. My apologies that we didn't quite get to every single question. And I look forward to seeing many of you at the Inland Waterways Association annual general meeting on Saturday. So thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone, and good day for now.